in which our lovers begin to learn the consequences of their actions. Chapter 14. Approaching Petersburg, Alexei Alexandrovitch was not only fully set on this decision, but had also composed in his head the letter he would write to his wife. Going into the hall porter's lodge, he glanced at the letters and papers sent from the ministry and ordered them to be brought to him in the study. "Unharness and admit no one," he said to the porter's question, emphasizing the words "admit no one" with a certain pleasure, which in him was a sign of good spirits. In his study, Alexei Alexandrovitch paced up and down a couple of times, stopped by the enormous desk, on which 6 candles had been lit beforehand by the valet, cracked his fingers, and sat down, sorting out his writing accessories. Placing his elbows on the desk, he inclined his head to one side, thought for a moment, and began to write, not stopping for a second. He wrote without addressing her, and in French, using the plural pronoun you, which does not have that character of coldness which it has in Russian. "In our last conversation I expressed my intention to inform you of my decision with regard to the subject of that conversation. Having thought it all over attentively, I am now writing with the purpose of fulfilling that promise. My decision is the following. Whatever your actions may have been, I do not consider myself justified in breaking the bonds by which a higher power has united us. A family may not be destroyed by the caprice, arbitrariness, or even crime of one of the spouses, and our life must go on as before. That is necessary for me, for you, for our son. I am fully convinced that you have repented and do repent for being the occasion of this present letter, and that you will assist me in eradicating the cause of our discord and in forgetting the past. Otherwise, you yourself can imagine what awaits you and your son. All this I hope to discuss in more detail at a personal meeting. Since the summer season is coming to an end, I would ask you to move back to Petersburg as soon as possible, not later than Tuesday. All necessary arrangements for your move will be made. I beg you to note that I ascribe particular importance to the fulfillment of my request. Karenina. P.S. Enclosed is the money you may need for your expenses." He read the letter over and remained pleased with it, especially with having remembered to enclose money. There was not a cruel word, not a reproach, but no lenience either. Above all, there was a golden bridge for return. Having folded the letter, smoothed it with a massive ivory paper knife, and put money in the envelope, with the pleasure always aroused in him by the handing of his well-arranged writing accessories, he rang. "Give this to the courier, to be delivered tomorrow to Anna Arkadyevna at the country house," he said, and stood up. "Yes, Your Excellency. Will you take tea in the study?" Alexei Alexandrovitch ordered tea to be served in the study, and, toying with the massive paper knife, went to the armchair by which a lamp had been prepared. With a French book he had begun reading on the Huguenot tables. Above the armchair, in a gilt frame, hung an oval portrait of Anna, beautifully executed by a famous painter. Alexei Alexandrovitch looked at it, The impenetrable eyes looked at him insolently and mockingly, as on that last evening of their talk. The sight of the black lace on her head, her black hair, and the beautiful white hand with its fourth finger covered with rings, splendidly executed by the painter, impressed him as unbearably insolent and defiant. After looking at the portrait for about a minute, Alexey Alexandrovitch gave such a start that his lips trembled and produced a burr, and he turned away, hastily sitting down in the armchair. He opened the book. He tried to read, but simply could not restore to himself the quite lively interest he had formerly taken in the Jacobin tables. He was looking at the book and thinking about other things. He was thinking not about his wife, but about a certain complication that had recently emerged in his state activity, which at that time constituted the main interest of his work. He felt that he was now penetrating this complication more deeply than ever, and that in his head there was hatching, he could say it without self-delusion, a capital idea, which would disentangle this whole affair, raise him in his official career, do harm to his enemies, and thus be of the greatest use to the state. As soon as the servant set down the tea and left the room, Alexey Alexandrovitch got up and went to his desk. Moving the portfolio of current cases into the middle, with a barely noticeable smile of self-satisfaction, he took a pencil from the stand and immersed himself in reading a complex case he had sent for, having to do with the forthcoming complication. The complication was the following: Alexey Alexandrovitch's particularity as a statesman, that characteristic feature proper to him alone — every rising official has such a feature — which, together with his persistent ambition, reserve, honesty, and self-assurance, had made his career, consisted in his scorn for paper bureaucracy, in reducing of correspondence, in taking as direct a relation to living matters as possible, and in economy. It so happened that in the famous commission of June 2nd, a case had been brought up about the irrigation of the fields in Zaraisk province, which belonged to Alexey Alexandrovitch's ministry, and presented a glaring example of unproductive expenditure and a paper attitude towards things. He knew that this was correct. The case of irrigating the fields in Zaraisk province had been started by the predecessor of his predecessor, and indeed a good deal of money had been, and was still being spent on this case, altogether unproductively, and it was obvious that the whole case could lead nowhere. Alexey Alexandrovitch, on taking over the post, understood this at once and wanted to get his hands on the case, but in the beginning, when he still felt himself not quite secure, he realized that this would be unwise, as it touched on too many interests. Later, occupied with other cases, he simply forgot it. Like other cases, it went on by itself, by the force of inertia. Many people lived off this case, in particular one very moral and musical family. All the daughters played stringed instruments. Alexey Alexandrovitch knew this family and had given away the bride at the oldest daughter's wedding. To bring up the case was, in his opinion, unfair on the part of a hostile ministry, because in every ministry there were even worse cases which, according to a certain official decency, no one brought up. Now, since the gauntlet had been thrown down before him, he boldly picked it up and demanded that a special commission be appointed to study and inspect the work of the commission on the irrigation of the fields in Zaraisk province. But in return he would give those gentlemen no quarter. He also demanded that a special commission be appointed in the case of the settling of racial minorities. The case of the settling of racial minorities had been brought up accidentally in the committee of June 2nd, and had been vigorously supported by Alexey Alexandrovitch as brooking no delay owing to the lamentable situation of the minorities. In the committee, this matter had served as a pretext for wrangling among several ministries. The ministry hostile to Alexey Alexandrovitch had argued that the situation of the minorities was quite prosperous, and the proposed reorganization might ruin their prosperity. and if there was anything wrong, it came from the failure of Alexei Alexandrovich's ministry to carry out the measures prescribed by law. Now Alexei Alexandrovich intended to demand, first, that a new commission be set up which would be charged with investigating the conditions of the minorities on the spot. Second, if it should turn out that the situation of the minorities was indeed as it appeared from official data available in the hands of the committee, another new expert commission should be appointed to investigate the causes of the dismal situation of the minorities from the A. Political, B. Administrative, C. Economic, D. Ethnographic, E. Material, and F. Religious points of view. Third, the hostile ministry should be required to supply information about the measures taken by that ministry over the last decade to prevent those unfavorable conditions in which the minorities now found themselves. Fourth, and finally, the ministry should be required to explain why, as could be seen from the information files number 17015 and 18308 of 5 December 1863 and 7 June 1864, it had acted in a sense directly contrary to the meaning of the Fundamental and Organic Law, Volume Article 18, and Note to Article 36. A flush of animation covered Alexei Alexandrovich's face as he quickly noted down these thoughts for himself. Having covered a sheet of paper with writing, he got up, rang, and sent a little note to his office manager about providing him with the necessary references. Getting up and pacing the room, he again glanced at the portrait, frowned, and smiled contemptuously. After reading a bit in the book on the Jacobin tables and reviving his interest in them, Alexei Alexandrovich went to bed at 11 o'clock, and when lying in bed, he recalled the incident with his wife. It no longer presented itself to him in the same gloomy light. If you enjoy this format, please leave a like and subscribe and return tomorrow for the next chapter.